Ah, bonjour tout le monde. Est-ce que vous pouvez reprendre vos places? Alors, je sais que après un repas bien copieux, et surtout après avoir mangé du tchéboudjen, ce sera difficile de revenir à un rythme normal, mais on va faire l'effort. Alors, le panel que je vais modérer traite de la transition de la citoyenneté au statut de réfugié et d'apatride. Vous tous, vous savez que pour aller dans le sens des discussions de ce matin, que ces notions de citoyens, de réfugiés et d'apatrides ont une histoire. Et c'est une histoire, en tout cas pour nous autres, qui date de la fin de la Première Guerre mondiale. La notion de réfugié est née après la fin de la Première Guerre mondiale. Le statut d'apatride est un peu plus âgé d'une seule année, 1917, après la révolution russe bolchevique, que les premiers apatrides sont apparus par le fait de l'expulsion de tous ceux qui étaient juifs, en tout cas tous ceux qui étaient contre la révolution bolchevique vers les autres pays européens. Donc, ces notions-là ont une histoire, sont des notions très chargées. Et nous, ici, le travail consiste surtout pour l'Afrique à voir si ces notions sont encore valables dans nos pays. Un apatride, c'est quelqu'un qu'aucun État ne considère comme son citoyen. Être africain, c'est même une revendication de l'Union africaine. On revendique non seulement l'africanité de tous ceux qui habitent l'Afrique, mais on revendique aussi l'africanité de tous les Noirs qui vivent dans le monde. Donc, c'est vraiment très intéressant que d'avoir un panel sur ces questions. Et dans les débats qu'on va avoir, il y aura des questions de décolonisation, des questions de crise que l'Afrique connaît, notamment dans la région où vous êtes au Sahel. Il y a des crises au Sahel. Vous avez la question développement, ces chiffres, actuellement, vous savez, depuis 1969, on a plus que 80 mathématiques.
Federation of African Unities Archives, which is housed on the campus of AU in Addis Ababa. And then I went to what Jean Ullman called the global shadow archives around the world. So the UN archives in New York, UNHCR in Geneva, but also organizations such as the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, always looking for correspondence with the OAU. And so what does Africa to me in this project mean? It means different member states of the OAU in the 1960s, but also, of course, crucially, those countries in Southern Africa that at that point in time were not liberated yet. And I'm looking at the OAU as a historical actor, but I differentiate and I look for actual people acting within this organization because I think that the people make a crucial difference. So today I want to attempt the impossible and tell you about the book's main argument in what's left of my 10 minutes. That means I will only have time to focus on exactly that and can't tell you more about the book. So if you're interested in the actual case studies, then you'll have to ask me later. I argue that the book, or that the confluence of decolonization was in full flow through the 1960s and that contemporary development paradigms led to the politicization of the nascent African refugee regime and created a historically unique moment. What was unique about this moment was that because of the confluence of the 3Ds, so displacement, decolonization, and development, refugees were actually welcomed in many African states, either as freedom fighters or as potential agents of economic development. While actors like the UNHCR aimed to depoliticize refugee contexts and foregrounded the humanitarian imperative during the 1960s, humanitarianism took backseat to development and political imperatives across the African continent. So let's take a moment to think about the concept of the African refugee regime. The African refugee regime emerged from a complex and dynamic negotiation between a range of actors, amongst them refugees themselves, experts, politicians, lawyers, national institutions in several African states, and international governments, as well as non-governmental organizations. And key amongst the governmental organizations was the OAU. So the regime was not fixed. Rather, it remained subject to constant negotiations, and its overall structure became visible only in hindsight. The phrase migration regime for Christopher Rass and Frank Wolf captures, and I quote here, the relationship between mobility, regulation, and discourse, end of quote. To my thinking, the African refugee regime then not only emerged as a set of conventions, rules, and principles, but it was and is constituted through continued negotiations of these very legalistic decision-making procedures. Moreover, it was also a function of negotiations of humanitarian development practices. To reiterate, I understand then the African refugee regime as a set of ongoing conversations between various actors who discussed what constituted a refugee and developed different ways of responding to quote-unquote refugees, such as they then were defined. The value of the term refugee regime, comprehended as an ongoing multi-level negotiation, lies precisely in its openness. It allows for contingency, for understanding of power formations amongst different historical actors, and it does so under a single analytic framework. I think about the negotiations that constituted the evolving refugee regime as having taken place across three different spheres. Of course, there's first the macro level. There was laws, norms, resolutions, conventions on the macro level. These were written by politicians, lawyers, and actors within international organizations. Then we've got the negotiation on the micro level, on the opposite direction, where encounters between refugees, local government officials, and relief providers who negotiated the everyday practice of the regime and the practical elements of refugee mobility faced. And then in the middle between those, we have the meso level. This included organizations like the OAU, the Organization for African Unity, as a platform for encounters between African politicians and diplomats on the one hand, but also ordinary refugees themselves. So in several of the negotiation spaces that the AU offered, refugees were actually invited as experts and consulted during the making, for instance, of the '69 Refugee Convention. This then was about refugee control, about defining power and attempts to direct and manage refugee movements. The OAU served as an arena for different negotiations of the regime and helped birth many of its different pillars. African foreign ministers and heads of states passed resolutions concerning refugees, and diplomats drafted the OAU's Refugee Convention. Its regular political meetings brought high-ranking politicians together. Its Refugee Commission worked to bring refugee experts and diplomats together, and the conferences it organized offered spaces for negotiation for attendees from international organizations, non-governmental organizations, and foreign governments. So there's a lot going on, lots of different venues to actually think through, where the organization as such was thinking about how to constitute, how to frame the refugee as a category. So to help us understand the OAU's role in establishing the African refugee regime in the 1960s, then, this book adopts James Scott's now classic approach of seeing like a state. It asks in this way, or it wants to understand how the OAU saw the concept of a refugee in the 1960s and how it understood what it meant to be a refugee. Also how its various bodies, amongst them the Commission, actually understood and governed, thank you, and governed refugees, how it made them visible as a category, quantifiable, and consequently then governable. When we attempt to quote unquote see refugees as the OAU quote unquote saw them, various bodies come into focus in which refugees were conceptualized and their relationship to decolonization, state making, and development negotiation. So the OAU then served as an observation point of the African refugee regime. The OAU throws into relief the entanglements between displacement, decolonization, and development. But there's a reason for why actually a lot of historians have hesitated to look at the OAU as an actor, and one of those reasons is the simple observation that the OAU actually ceased to exist in 2002 and transformed into the AU. But just that because an organization ceases to exist, it's usually not a very good reason not to historically study it. And we should not forget that the 1960s was a time period of a lot of hope, a lot of innovation, a lot of trust also in solving the big matters. And for instance, decolonization was key of the agenda of the OAU at the time, which did actually also get semi-resolved in the lifetime of the organization. And so it was also setting itself the goal to, and here's, I'm using the parlance of the time, quote, to solve the refugee problem. So the idea was really, we will solve this. There will not be a refugee problem after the 1960s. And yes, refugee problem is source language here. So in that sense, I think it's really important that we turn our gaze back to the 1960s and think about that moment in history where actors thought about why do we need to have the category of refugee rethought on the continent? How do we need to rethink it? Because it's currently based on a European history of displacement. And then they drew up their own convention to transform that into legal aspects. They have founded a refugee education bureau, which was sending refugees everywhere on scholarships to build future leaders for then to be liberated nations. They were also thinking about something that we still continue thinking about, which is refugee resettlement in terms of zonal development. So there's lots of things that we can sort of think through how it was originally discussed in the 1960s and what it means then for today. And that's what I hope to be doing with this book. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much for also keeping the time, even though. Merci beaucoup, Marcia, surtout d'avoir placé la question du régime des réfugiés en Afrique dans un contexte aussi important que celui que tu as décrit. Donc, je vais donner la parole à Henry Kam de l'Université de Boua pour Boya au Cameroun, pour nous parler de la crise des déplacements dans le Sahel et des questions humanitaires qui s'y rattachent. Merci.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity, and thank God today I'm the first gentleman who is coming to break the monopoly of the ladies. My paper is on displacement crisis in the Sahel and neglected global humanitarian attention. This was a paper I started having an interest in emerging trends in displacement crisis in Africa because I've been carrying out research on conflict. I happened that the call for papers for this conference came, and I decided to apply. And unlike Marcia, I live in the past and I try to connect with the present. So I try to also scribble something. And me. So what am I talking about? The Sahel is, as you see on the board, is covers the area from the Atlantic coast in the west to the Red Sea in the east. But there are contestation as to that. So it covers from Mauritania, Mali, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, northern Nigeria, Cameroon, and the rest. What is my claim? I claim and I argue I'm really in the past. Can somebody help me out, please? Okay. My claim, I argue that the displacement crisis in the Sahelian belt of Africa suffers from global humanitarian neglect, unlike Tapsoba was saying. So I argue against it because of competing geopolitical, economic, strategic, religious, ideological interests of Western countries that include France, has been very dominant in the Sahel, especially the core Sahel, Russia, China, America, among others. And their actions have only promoted rather than abate the crisis. By way of introduction, the Sahel has had a pitiful displacement record in the past few decades. And it is very strategically located because it connects North Africa with Southern Africa, West to East Africa, and it has a long history of movements. And it is endowed with enormous natural and human resources, which need to be tapped. And the common causes that we are made to understand is that the crisis is because of armed conflict, yes. Excruciating poverty, yes. Unfriendly climatic conditions, intercommunal clashes, overscarce resources, rising temperatures, drought and desertification, as well as intense competition over dwindling natural resources, such as fertile land and water, between farmers and herders, and limited economic opportunities. That is the dominant narrative. And therefore, the failure of global humanitarian intervention, as the narrative also goes, is that there is insufficient funding, inadequate media coverage, among others. But beyond the surface, and that's where my argument is, beyond the surface is a complex interplay of superpower interests, which are scarcely sung, but which are driving the despicable displacement scenario in this region of Africa. Some sell arms, fuel rebellion against state authorities, and give support elsewhere, enough support elsewhere. I must call your attention to the fact that it is still at the very early stages of my research, but I have tentative findings. Methodological approach and challenges. I come from a historical interpretation of changing dynamics in the Sahel. I look at data-driven monitoring by organizations, different organizations that follow up movements and displacement. I do a triangulation of quantitative data. I will do what I intend to do. Data about displaced persons and qualitative information through interviews. Then, in fact, one of the challenges is that there's contestation about the limits of the Sahel region, and then lopsided view of the motivations for displacement crisis by most available sources. A lot of sources you read have a lopsided view about the displacement crisis. And then there's confidential sources that are not readily available. That's a challenge for public scrutiny, especially about the involvement of Western countries in the Sahel. Then reliability of data on displacement statistics. Are the data, can it really be relied on? And what's the scale? And then we have sample selection and access. Am I going to do that? That becomes a challenge. Okay, I go to the core of the matter now. From my preliminary readings, the Chinese are selling arms to Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. And this has promoted political violence and instability. Why are they selling arms? To who and for what purpose? Secondly, radical Islamic groups like the Salafist group for preaching and combat have fueled conflict and displacement. Religious contestation has contributed to displacement in this region. We need to know that the Sahel, predominantly, the religion, Islam, is a core religion within the Sahel, especially the core Sahelian countries. And there's an ideological warfare as to whether Islam ideologically should dominate this area or the Western philosophy. So this is at play as far as the Sahel is concerned. French security policy in the region is to protect colonial areas. We know the long history of the French. Rich in resources and markets that strengthens France within a fierce economic competition among rivals. We know the situation of France now, how they are trying to readapt, but all habits die hard. And then funding of military apparatus, for example, in Mali, was at the expense of civilian institutions. And this this had an impact on their stability. You know, a lot is spent on the military, and civilian institutions' attention is not given to them. And in a case of crisis, in a crisis situation, it becomes very difficult for them to cope. So America is in the logic of gaining new areas of influence. And you know what Trump is doing now. But it's been a long time policy, and Trump is implementing in the war to secure resources and markets between major international powers. What I'm therefore saying is that some of these countries are interested in their interest. And the more there's a crisis, the better for them. They will exploit, they will get the resources they want, they get the clear corridors, and they handle things the way they want. Russia, the use of the Wagner Group with several mercenaries in Mali did not abate the displacement dilemma. Rather, it exacerbated it. Prior to the Wagner Group, Russia exported arms, supplied military equipment, and deployed troops, with consequences being internal conflicts and displacement. Their actions are not helping. Their actions are fueling. Their actions are promoting the conflicts. And they are happy that things be the way they are because in chaos, they get what they want. One-time support to the French and other European forces from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger as members of G5 Sahel to confront jihadist groups was the source of several attacks. The question you ask, why is the G5 in the Sahel not as active as it was before? It is because of these competing interests, and which are not helping. And so the argument is that they are at the center of the displacement crisis. Research gaps filled. So as a preliminary research that I started doing before I saw the call for papers, at least if there's anything that this paper has had to do is the research has drawn the attention to the lopsided dominant narrative on the underlying causes of a despicable displacement crisis in the Sahel, which is always focusing attention on the countries themselves and the internal dynamics without looking at what these other countries are doing to create the problem. This presentation has revealed that over the years, Western competing interests have led to a crisis situation in the Sahel with the consequences of displacement even across borders. The relative deprivation theory, which among other things contend that the discrimination leads to an increase in the risk of violence, has its limitations as an explanatory framework for analyzing the scenario in the Sahel. Competing actors of European and other global powers in the Sahel show clearly that they are within very good intention. They are not within, they are they are not within good intention. The so-called support for some of these Saharan countries is rather damaging to their stability. And then the crime displacement theory, which assumes that crime is inelastic because perpetrators are flexible in relation to time, also has its limitation in this context. This study clearly shows and will show that a recognition threat from some of these Western countries can lead to an adequate response mechanism that can prevent them their flexibility and re-strategizing to continue to reap where they did not sow, and in doing so, creating a humanitarian problem in the form of massive displacement. You see, when you listen to Ibrahim Traore, he goes back to history. And I made them understand that Ibrahim Traore did not read history. But I'm comforted because when I listen to him, he has his good lessons of history. And he speaks to those who don't want to hear what he's saying because it's what has been happening over time. The concept of humanitarianism, which is an organized form of assistance and protection for those who suffer or are likely to suffer from armed conflicts or diseases, has also been challenged in this presentation on rethinking the displacement crisis in the Sahel. The competing Western countries in this region, for various reasons, have turned a blind eye to massive displacement and associated problems by not coming together to organize and offer assistance. Those who have claimed to do so have done it in bad faith and with the intention of reaping where they did not, where they sowed chaos. This has made some countries of the Sahel to remain in a quagmire, at least for the foreseeable future. That's my preliminary observations, and from the readings that I've had, it shows that these countries want uranium, they want gold, they want bauxite, and all the other resources. And the more there is a crisis situation, the better for them, because they are going to exploit the resources without much resistance. That is where I end my preliminary evaluation of this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you, and for keeping the time. Thank you very much. So you hear an explanation of the crisis and the role that Western countries have played in fueling and also maintaining the crisis. That is approach of the issue, but we will come back to that. Now, I will call on Gifty to come and make a presentation on inequality in wash access among displaced persons in Ghana and Sierra Leone. So we also have 10 minutes, and I'm keeping the time.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gifty, and I'll be presenting my study titled From Displacement From displacement to deprivation, inequalities in health, water, sanitation, and hygiene access among displaced persons in Ghana and then Sierra Leone. When we talk about displacement, we often focus on movement, people leaving one place for the other. However, displacement is not just about movement, it's about what people lose and even the essential resources and the services they're supposed to have access to, such as water, sanitation, healthcare, and also hygiene services. I'll be using an urban political ecology approach to critique and then understand beyond the logistical and then technical issues we talk about when it comes to water, sanitation, and then hygiene. Or rather, I would like to use look at the governance frameworks, the power dynamics when it comes to accessing these services. So this will be my outline. Sorry, it's not showing fully over there. Introduction, the gaps, study context, and the methodological approach, the key empirical findings, the theoretical implications, that's the challenging existing frameworks, and then I'll conclude. Less attention has been paid to wash access. Most of the times when we talk about water, sanitation, and hygiene, we look at them as logistical and then technical issues. But then it goes beyond that. We also need to look at the foundations, the systems that constrains these people to access it. So drawing on political ecology, as I said earlier, I conceptualize displacement as uneven infrastructural incorporation. Displaced persons are physically present within urban and peri-urban centers, but in terms of wash access, they are marginalized. Therefore, sorry, displacement persists not just through mobility, but also through access to basic services. So I asked these questions. These are the gaps that I hope to fill. How does forced displacement reshape access to wash and health services? How do governance arrangements and spatial marginalization produce inequality? What does this review about the nature of protracted displacement in West Africa? I adopted a qualitative approach for both Ghana and Sierra Leone in studying this. So in Sierra Leone, I had a problem. The only problem I had was getting refugees to ask questions. Most of them were IDPs because most of the refugees were dispersed. But for Ghana, I did have IDPs and then both IDPs and refugees to interview and also get my answers. So for Ghana, we did 10, and then for Sierra Leone, we did 12. Okay. So across both jurisdictions, there was they all encounter persistent displacement. So when I say persistent or recurrent displacement, I mean first maybe one is displaced by war, but when they move to their destination, they encounter climate-induced and then environmental, developmental displacement in addition. So they find themselves constantly being displaced. And all through these displacements, they lose assets. So this woman said that was in Sierra Leone. And I pray it does not repeat itself in this community. Because my husband, who is the breadwinner, lost one of his feet to the flooding. As a result of that disaster, my husband's foot got severely injured and started getting rotten in a few days at the hospital. The only alternative was to be operated on and amputate the infected foot. He was the breadwinner, and everything was snatched from them. They had to move to a different place. So how does this person start life again? So it's not just about movement, it's about what it costs the people, the displaced persons. Similar situations in Ghana. For Ghana, most of them, especially with these displaced persons, do not even have access to banking systems. So they keep their money, everything that they have, in their rooms. And then when flooding takes place or anything, they lose everything and have to restart again. But where do they start from? That's the question. So access to water and sanitation is shaped by infrastructural weakness, affordability, and fragmented governance. These practices are often framed as behavioral issues. However, the findings suggest they reflect constrained options within commodified and weakly regulated service environments. So when you go to these communities, you realize that the government doesn't really regulate anything because of the nature of the place. It's more like a slum or an informal settlement with these displaced persons living in. So it is more of a market service based. So I tell or determine how much I take from you for you to access water and then my maybe the toilet facility or anything, and even refuse dump. We'll come to that one too. That also has a different governmental and then power relation issue. So responsibility for wash services is dispersed across national ministries, local authorities. In Ghana, it was more for the local authorities, but they do nothing. So in these communities, they have chiefs, especially for Ghana. They have chiefs who are supposed to regulate everything that goes on. But unfortunately, they take money from people because they are the higher ups. They have the say. They can control the minute things that goes on. The government doesn't really care about these people. So over there, they'll tell you that nobody's coming to save us. So their only hope is the chief, who also, would I say, sorry, but corrupt. So they have to, in the next image, you see where they dump the refuse. So they take money from these people and dump refuse in the heart of the community, not even considering the public health effects and nothing. But these people have nowhere to go. Financially, they are constrained. So they still have to stay there and make ends meet. So we asked one of the participants. He said, it is a refuse dump. The elders and chiefs allow the refuse drivers to dump the rubbish here because they take money from them. This community needs bigger gutters so that water can flow into the sea. So, as I said, it's an informal settlement. So it's constantly being flooded. I should have said this earlier, but the kind of displacement we see in Ghana and Sierra Leone is more about being displaced today. I move somewhere else and come back. So we conceptualize or say this as displacement in situ. So you move and then you come back because you have nowhere to go. So that was also another aspect. Okay. So in terms of health as infrastructural and structural deficits, so we interpret them as the embodied consequences of social environmental inequality, where unequal urban infrastructures translate directly into differentiated bodily harm. Instead of always thinking that it is a public health issue, why don't we step back and look at it as an infrastructural or issue? If you look at these people, if you create the gutters, if you get a proper dam site, will these things persist? So instead of just looking at them as public health issues, we conceptualize and then think that it should be looked at from the governance aspect instead of behavioral issues, because they have nowhere to dump it. Definitely they will be in the sea, definitely will be at open places. So this is the image I was talking about. Right here, I don't know if you can see this side. There are buildings there. And this is a dam site. Behind it is a lagoon. So I'll leave that to you to judge. But it's when you go there and you ask them, why are you still here? They tell you, I have nowhere to go. The other places are too expensive. Nobody wants to help us. So this is where I'll live. So they're constantly having issues of cholera, typhoid, respiratory disease because they burn these refuse at night. And people live just close to the dam site. We asked one woman, she said she sleeps with nose masks because she has to cough throughout the night because of the smoke coming from the dam site. Yeah, but within this, we see social cohesion. They try to help themselves because there's no government support. They try to help themselves by, if a neighbor is in trouble, they go to that neighbor, they help them. It's likewise. So if you don't help me, I might not also help you. But then you find them coming together, even in terms of savings, to save and then help each other or one another. So that's also another person in terms of community assistance and then support from friends and then family within the same dilemma or within the same community. So challenging existing frameworks. I'll just read through this. First, displacement is not solely about mobility. It is about repositioning within hierarchies of infrastructure and governance. Secondly, vulnerability is not inherent to displaced populations. It is produced through the intersection of environmental risk, governance fragmentation, and commodified service delivery. As I said earlier, they have to buy the water, buy everything. So I asked someone, if you do not have the money, what do you do? I'll use the sea. And that is also an issue of sanitation. Because if the person is using the sea, at the end of the day, it will affect everybody around. And then the third will be humanitarian temporality. Most of the times when it happens, they just go to the field and just give them brief assistance. But then we need a long-term integration. It needs to be integrated into the national laws that would help these people live within their communities, or at least sensitize them to a certain point. So I'll end with this statement. Displacement persists not only through movement, but through deprivation. Thank you.
Thank you. thank you very much for bringing the governance side of all these issues of refugees and in Sierra Leone and Ghana. Thank you for bringing those dimensions. Now I will turn to Irene. Irian, see. Irian from the University of Wits, who will be talking about migration management, racial order, and the politics of categorization. Remind us that you come from an apartheid system.
It's a terrible thing to be an expert in. Can you bring my PowerPoint up, please? My watch is going to give me an electric shock after 8 minutes, so that I know. Okay, 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 okay. Maybe 3. Okay. I'll just. Okay, so that's just the title. How do I click it forward? With this? Ah, there we go. Okay, I'm going to move here so oh no, it went away. There we go. Okay, I'm gonna move for a second because then people from there can see. Okay, I'm gonna start with a story. This very grumpy looking man was a guy called Benjamin Tillman. And he was a US senator in the sort of early 20th century in the American South. And his nickname was Pitchfork Ben. He once got very angry with something that the president said, and he threatened to stick a pitchfork into him, and the nickname stuck. I'm just giving this to give you a bit of an idea of this guy's character. And he came from a long line of plantation owners in the South, and he was absolutely devastated that slavery was over. He was, 40 years later, he would still give these long speeches where he complained and said, the good old days where everybody was just accepting of their station. And he said this made relations between black and white very peaceful and respectful. And now all of this was different. Now that black people were no longer under the positive influence of their white masters, they had reverted to their true nature. And it was chaos, and that had to be contained. And I think all of his contemporaries knew that this guy was a bit of an enfant terrible, like he was quite Trumpian in his rhetoric. Ultimately, many of them agreed that emancipation had been a bad thing for black people. There were even medical professionals who claimed that wanting to be free or being free caused mental illness in black people. Yeah. And I think that no, don't go away. This binary of good and bad blackness. So for Tillman, a good black person was someone who was obedient, subservient, and contained. And a bad black person was immoral and deviant and dangerous. Bad, of course, in this case, racist code for being free and equal. And I think that both of these notions of good and bad blackness, they draw on very dehumanizing stereotypes, both of them, racist stereotypes. And then the categories of migration management, that sort migrants into different groups, into forced and voluntary, into asylum seekers and economic migrants. I think it picks up this binary, and I think there's a very strong continuity between, someone like Tillman saying, I like black people, but only if they're slaves. And today's mantra of we like migrants, but they must be legal. So what I will suggest is that we maybe should think of the categories of migration management a little bit more as sort of a cast of characters in a story, in a fictional story, a story that Europe tells about Africa and about itself, and I think in a much broader sense, obviously, a story about black and white and the relationship between them. So let's look at how these stereotypes of the past have made it into today. Hold on. There we go. And I want to apologize before. I really don't like giving these kinds of ideas any airtime. I think they're very oppressive, they're very violent stereotypes, but I think also a lot of modern migration governance is oppressive and violent. So the first stereotype is that of sort of animality. This idea that black people are driven by impulse and by instinct and not by intellect, and that they're aggressive, sexually promiscuous, that they can't control themselves, and for this reason need to be controlled. And I think this kind of narrative of the sort of sexually, morally corrupted and aggressive, you find a lot in this discourse on trafficking victims and on smugglers and traffickers and jailers. The second racist stereotype is this idea of Black ignorance, of irrationality, that Black people don't produce proper knowledge, that they don't innovate, that there are no ideas, that they're sort of a bit childlike and helpless. And for this reason, again, need to be guided and instructed by white people. And I think that kind of stereotype we see again in this victim of trafficking that doesn't really know what it's getting itself into, and also this discourse that we see in awareness raising campaigns around migrants not really knowing what they're getting themselves into when they get on the boat, that they have no idea what reality is like, and yeah, they really need white people to explain to them how the world works, basically. And then the last, or the third, I mean, there's more, but I'm gonna just do this one. The last racist stereotype, I think that's very important in shaping these categories, is this idea of stagnation. I think that Sarkozy came to Dakar and he said, and this is now my 9th grade high school French, "Le drame de l'Afrique, c'est que l'homme africain n'est pas assez entré dans l'histoire." So this idea that, you know, Africans just do what they need to do to survive from day to day. They don't plan for the future. They have no real past. They're kind of stagnant, and they don't really want to work hard for some reward in the future, which then makes them prone to deviance because they kind of do what they want to get, but they don't want to work for it. And the remedy for this is, again, white people telling them how to be disciplined, how to be productive. So work and labor becomes a sort of moral cure for them. And I think that's something that we really see a lot in discussions about asylum seekers, who are often immediately under suspicion that what they actually want is a better and an easier life, that they haven't really tried to work hard at home, that they're trying to have a shortcut, and they don't care about laws and they don't care about rules. Yeah, hold on, I just lost my train of thoughts. Okay. And then, yeah, in the category of the returnee, you know, as the IOM celebrates the returnee, especially the voluntary returnee, I think we see that kind of moral cure of work playing out. So people are encouraged to go back, to dream small, to take small steps, not to take more than what they can have at home. And yeah, there's this overall message underneath that Africans do not need and should not try to have more than what they are allocated, which I think is also something that you see in the root cause approach, this idea that as soon as you sort survival out at home, people will no longer move, as if they would only move because they're absolutely forced to, in these ideas around first safe countries or third safe countries, that just surviving is enough, basically. You, as a Black person, as an African, you can't wish for more, really. Yeah, and obviously the common denominator in all of these three stereotypes is that there's some sort of deficiency that can only be alleviated by white instruction, white rule, white guidance. How am I doing for time? Yeah, okay. So okay, it's one more slide, yeah. Okay. Forgetting that this is not linked. All right, so in closing, I would like to make 3 suggestions for what this means for us who study migration. The first one, and that brings me back to Faisal's opening remarks about what do we do with these categories? Do we just accept them? And I think if we tinker with them, if we actually try to make them more accurate or more realistic, in some ways we kind of not challenging the assumptions underneath. And that our critique then, even if we sort of critiquing the categories, we're actually stabilizing them fundamentally, but not really going into these assumptions underneath. And then the second point I want to make, I think I overheard Marcia yesterday with Asaf in their 4-hour marathon conversation in the bus saying something like we should all be more like historians, or we should all be historians. And I completely agree, because I think the story of this good and bad Blackness and these stereotypes is not new. And the migration studies tends to be quite focused on the present. But looking further back can give us really important signposts to look out for. And I think we can clearly see how the sort of erasure of the past that we see in official political discourses about the relationship between Africa and Europe is a way to disguise how inequality is reproduced. So as scholars, I think we need to surface that. And then lastly, for all its turn towards being more reflexive, migration studies has recently as a field sort of been celebrating itself for coming into maturity of, you know, having reached milestones and being very reflexive. But I think there's very little acknowledgement about how, if we accept that these, well, I hope you believe me, that these stereotypes shape the migration categories, then I think it would be, at best naive and at worst quite deliberate to not think that these stereotypes also creep into our own work as migration scholars, as a migration researching community. And I think there are not enough links that are being made between, the current imbalances, we've touched about this before, current imbalances on who writes about Africa, who gets to be heard, who publishes in which journals. And we have to link this to these much longer standing genealogies of epistemicide that we've seen on the continent. And together with my colleague, Caroline Kiato, we've just done a bibliometric study on 30 years of African migration scholarship and looking at, who's writing, who's saying things, and it's pretty devastating. So I think we really need to look at the results. Thank you.
Thank you. You even offered us 1 minute. So that's good conversation. Thank you very, very much for the thought and also the question that you raised. And I think we will come back to that. So the last presentation, and not the least, is by Stella. Stella will talk us about disability, politics, displacement, and exclusion. Huh? Yeah, the slide. Okay. Come.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm grateful to be here. Thank you so much for the organizers for making it possible for me to stand in presence of great men and women to present my dissertation. My name is Stella Ijomon Mebu. I'm coming from Nigeria. My topic is disability politics of displacement and exclusion. Okay. Yes, sir. My background of study here talks about women with disabilities in IDP camps face compounded vulnerabilities. They face different kinds of problems like flooding, conflict, displacement. You can agree with me if there is a fire alarm in this place right now, there is a serious fire alarm. Every one of us will evacuate. You will not remember that I'm here because you're fighting for your life. That's exactly what they face in that IDP camp. They face different kinds of problems. When there is conflict, when there is flooding, you find out that no one to help them, even in that camp. Research problem here is displaced women in internally displaced persons in IDP camps face structural exclusion. Humanitarian systems often fail to address disability, mobility, and needs. The challenges in aid distributions, camp governance, and inequality. There is limited research on experiences of disabled women. Research objectives. I said one, examine how disabled women experience internal displacement. Two, analyze how humanitarian governance reproduce exclusions. Explore how gender displacement, disability, and displacement intersect. Highlight forms of coping and survivor networks. Methodology. I said here, research designs. We're able to, we had about 232 participants, disabled women, and their caregivers. The area of study was in Rivers State, Nigeria. And we're able to collect data by participating observation, semi-structured interviews were carried out. We also focused on group discussion. We had a group discussion. We discussed a lot of things. In fact, there was a particular discussion that we had. I met a lady, she has been bedridden for almost 4 years. And it was so sympathetic, that fateful day. But I thank God for my group that we went together. We were able to render help. We were able to encourage her. And we were able to support her, to tell her that this condition is not the end of your life. You can make use of it by helping yourself. Last, policies document was analyzed. The theoretical framework here, we used to intersectionality, examine overlapping forms of inequality, social model of disability. We focus on barriers rather than individual implementations. My key findings: infrastructure, barriers, limited access to service, exclusion from governance, coping, and resilience. You can agree with me, these women, even in this their condition, they try as much as they can to cope within themselves, to help themselves. Community also coming to help them. Friends also coming to help them. Church also coming to help them. The theoretical contribution here, I said citizenship, legal citizens, but practically excluded. Humanitarian governance can reproduce inequalities. Intersectionality, disability plus gender plus displacement. The implications: needs for one, exclusive campaign design, accessibilities, services, representations in governance. Displacement is not temporal, it is a structural issues. In conclusion, camps are space of protection, exclusions, social structuring. Women with disabilities face systematic barriers, shows resilience and agencies. Okay, I said aid distribution sometimes prioritize, it has gone off, sometimes prioritize less vulnerable rather than vulnerable groups. I want us to note that. In my recommendations, I said internal displacement must be treated as a long-term structural issue. Humanitarian governance must prioritize disability inclusion. Politics should improve accessibilities, participation, and service delivery. Finally, it It is not the impact that disable, but the barriers that block participation, by Mike Olive, 1990. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Stella. Thank you for the nice presentation. Not later, I will take it. And thank you very, very much for the presentation. And I see that your presentation and the one made by Gifty, they align to each other about some of the issues that you raised and the one that she raised. And I think she made a very powerful statement. Citizen, but practically excluded. I think that idea needs to be kept in our mind on how to resolve that kind of situation. Now, colleagues, we have heard all the presentation. We have a pause cafe. Now, pardon? Huh? Ah, okay, okay. No. What I wanted to say, we have a pause cafe. Either we continue the conversation, we finish our discussion, and then we go take the pause cafe before leaving. Okay? That's fine with all of you? Excellent. So now, we have heard all the 5 presentations. Questions? This area one, number one, I agree with Madame Yo. Number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Okay. Number 1.
Ok, mais bon, je vais m'exprimer en français. Il y a des traducteurs qui vont faire le travail. Moi, j'aimerais revenir sur la présentation de Gifty en Ponsa. Elle a beaucoup insisté sur la notion d'accès. Je pense qu'à côté de l'accès, il y a la notion d'accessibilité aussi qu'il faut voir. L'accessibilité, c'est-à-dire la capacité financière, par exemple, pour les populations déplacées ou réfugiées, à pouvoir disposer des services. Souvent, l'État peut mettre des services en place. Je prends un exemple banal dans certaines localités où j'ai mené mes recherches. L'État fait des forages pour faciliter l'accès à l'eau potable des populations déplacées. Mais en même temps, on vous dit qu'il faut payer. Il faut payer au bidon, c'est-à-dire selon le récipient pour pouvoir avoir accès à l'eau. Or, ces populations déplacées, n'ayant pas d'activité économique, ne peuvent pas payer l'eau. Donc, le service peut être disponible, mais il n'est pas accessible financièrement parce qu'il y a des barrières et des contraintes auxquelles les déplacés sont soumis. Il en est de même dans les écoles. Je fais une digression. Dans les écoles, on a vu que les enfants des déplacés sont réinscrits dans des écoles dans les villages d'accueil. Mais il arrive très souvent que ces enfants abandonnent en cours de chemin parce que à l'école, on exige souvent ou on demande aux parents certaines cotisations, des contributions financières que les populations déplacées ne peuvent pas satisfaire. Donc, je pense qu'ici, sur la question des services, il y a ces deux notions qu'il faudrait chaque fois mettre en parallèle. La disponibilité, l'accès et l'accessibilité. On peut créer une école à une longue distance et qui va empêcher, par exemple, les parents de laisser aller leurs enfants parce que aller dans ces localités, c'est courir aussi le risque d'être agressé en cours de chemin. Donc, c'est des notions qui se ressemblent. I don't know in English si c'est la même chose en anglais, mais en français, il y a cette nuance. L'accès et l'accessibilité ne sont pas forcément les mêmes. C'est juste une contribution, ce n'est pas une question que je voulais poser. Merci.
Thank you so much for these great presentations. And my main question is to Yeah. I can't turn that far. My question is to Irian. Thank you for bringing in race. I think it's often quite sidelined in the debates on forced displacement and migration. And I was wondering this distinction between good and bad black person. What kind of understanding of racism is behind it? Because like to me, I would guess it's a bit like a civilizing mission. Like people could be made obedient and I had to think of Emson Hagen's work. You know him? He works on an ontological understanding of race and migration governance. And he would say there's always this ontological understanding behind it that basically the black person is reduced to a non-human, a slave. This is always behind it. And I was wondering how you would relate to that, if you would see that even in these two distinctions, it's kind of the same. And a smaller question to Marcia. You were mentioning this politicization of the refugee regime. And at the same time, the OAU convention has depoliticized the refugee, right? They are not allowed to be politically active. So how does this, or maybe you can help me what you mean by politicization and why it ultimately leads to a depoliticization in the understanding of the refugee. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I want to send my comment to Masha. The issue of UNHCR was started in, I think, 1951 and all that. And during that period, most African states were not actually gotten their independence. But I want to ask if at what point in time the newly African states, at what point were they introduced, or at the refugee issues began to hit the global, as in the African issue, began to touch the global level? Since when at the formation of the Refugee Convention, UNHCR as an institution, the African issue was submerged in all, as in the independence, as in getting their independence and all that. So Africa at that then didn't have any what do you call it, argument on refugee per se, not until maybe in the 80s and all that. I just want to understand that angle.
Okay.
Thank you so much for all the presenters and the facilitator. My first question is to Marsha, in comparing the 1951 or the UNHCR refugee regime and the OAU. I think you are referring to the 1961 Convention on Refugees. There are a lot of similarities, but the OAU Convention, which of course is approved 6 years after the OAU was established, it has additional provision, at least for the group level recognition of refugees. But what additional unique contribution were you expecting, I mean, to be of useful to the African context? Second question is to Henry. Yes, we understand that that interference from the West or from different interest groups is huge, but I'm not getting that all these different groups, the US or Russia or China, are all seeing that they could benefit better when that region is destabilized. Sometimes I think when regions are well started, when a country or region is is stable and in order, you can even do more business and you can reap better benefits through strong relationships with the states. And I'm not getting why each, or is there any difference within these groups in terms of looking into what would really benefit them, a stable region or a disturbed region? And Aman, your argument, what is the major source of your argument? Was there any target group or target policies or provisions, or what's the source of your claim and arguments? Thank you very much.
Oh, were you the five? Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks to all the speakers for the great presentation. You take us to another level of understanding. Um, I think the first presentation, I'm thinking about the regimes. And I like the history, but I'm also thinking about contemporary times. How do we bring them together? So the Global Compact for Refugees. Before that, we had the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework. And so how do we tie in and the role of AU themselves? Are we saying they didn't take it because they had a position when it came to the refugee compact? What their position it with what was before? I don't know how the analysis looks like. How do we unpack that also? But beyond all that, we also have critique of the fact that all these things didn't include climate refugees and displacement generally, which we felt were one of the key things, and so came up with the Kampala Convention. And since it's a book, so I'm thinking along these lines, how do we bring all this together? Then maybe the other one is the Western influence. I think we are all on the same page that we are tired of Western influence. Now I'm thinking beyond that. Yes, we in Ghana, for instance, when the Burkina Faso thing happened, a lot of people on the streets were happy. The gentleman came to Ghana for our inauguration. He received more funds than even the president himself. And so it seems people are supporting it. But the recent policies that are coming out of that enclave. So don't export cereals from us. I'm giving you 2 weeks. Don't buy food stuff from us, even within the region. Yes, they said free movement is still there. They haven't said they are not part of the free movement. All that they are saying is that we are Sahel and all that. But I'm looking at beyond that. How do we support ourselves? We all agree, yes, do this. But how do we take ourselves from these restrictive measures that we are experiencing? I think once after 6 months, he gives us new rules and regulations to follow. So I want to hear your take on that. And maybe the displacement and the disability, the health. I think these are very interesting things that we always overlook. And I'm looking at the complexities of it. Displacement itself is an issue. If you are disabled, that gives it another problem. And so the compilation of issues and the health challenges associated with that. Maybe if Gifty, you also came up with disability people in that context, it would be interesting to see your position on that. And then if Stella, perhaps I don't know how you some of the issues that came up. You said some of them, but in terms of the way out, how are people perceiving themselves out of that enclave? Thank you.
Ok, merci professeur Khan. Je vais parler en français. Allez, je commencerai par Madame Marcia. Madame Marcia a utilisé une expression sur les régimes africains de réfugiés. Si elle peut revenir encore sur cette question-là, de nous expliquer que prône le régime africain des réfugiés. Et c'est une nouvelle expression pour nous. On a besoin vraiment qu'on nous donne plus de détails sur ce régime-là. Et le deuxième présentateur, c'était M. Henri Cam. Dans les raisons de la crise au Sahel que M. Khan a soulevé, M. Kam, autant pour moi, a soulevé. Et pour les conflits armés, je pense que ça, c'est bien documenté. Mais au niveau des changements climatiques, comme deuxième cause dans la hiérarchisation qui a été faite tout à l'heure, j'ai du mal à comprendre les changements climatiques. Est-ce qu'aujourd'hui, on a la documentation? Est-ce qu'on a les éléments probants pour dire qu'il y a des crises, des changements climatiques dans le Sahel, de la même manière qu'on parle des crises liées aux conflits armés? Toi qui as travaillé sur cette question, si tu as des éléments, c'est mieux de mettre à notre disposition aussi. Et la troisième présentatrice, c'est Madame Gifti. Là où je n'ai pas compris sur Madame Gifti, c'est Madame Gifti parle de la marginalisation des migrants en matière d'assainissement. Je me suis dit, est-ce qu'il existe une marginalisation des migrants en matière d'assainissement? Nos pays éprouvent des difficultés pour l'assainissement. Ce n'est pas un problème de marginalisation des migrants. C'est comme si on avait déjà résolu le problème d'assainissement et que les migrants étaient les seuls à souffrir. Mais la question, elle est globale. La question d'assainissement, elle est globale. Donc, au niveau des migrants, on ne devait même pas dire qu'elles sont marginalisées pour cette question. Elles sont peut-être marginalisées pour des questions économiques. En matière d'assainissement, je pense qu'on devait relativiser à ce niveau-ci. Je vais chuter avec Madame Stella. Et quand Madame Stella parle des personnes déplacées, handicapées, elle parle des femmes et que la situation concerne plus les femmes. Je me suis dit que dans cette étude, quand on prend les femmes comme victimes, c'est aussi bien dans les enquêtes que vous avez réalisées, dans les focus group que vous avez réalisés, d'associer les hommes. Est-ce qu'un homme qui est handicap aura plus de chances à bénéficier de l'apport de l'État qu'une femme, vous pensez? Ou les deux subissent la même chose? Parce qu'on est à l'impression qu'on commence aussi à faire une discrimination pour dire qu'à chaque fois, c'est des femmes qui sont victimes. Mais les hommes qui sont dans la même situation, je pense, vivent la même chose. Il serait souhaitable ici de faire la différence. Si les femmes handicapées sont plus défavorisées que les hommes, en ce moment-là, vous tirez des conclusions. Mais si les deux peuvent vivre les mêmes situations, je pense qu'il fallait aussi en parler. Merci, professeur.
Thank you, all presenters. My first question goes to Marcia. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I was trying to understand how I don't know how long your historical construction goes, but if you, given how refugee as a phenomena started and as institution UNHCR and so on started in Europe, then it already had some intellectual history to it, even before World War II. And then I was thinking of if there are some intellectual history to the African refugee regime and how they start to construct the African voice in the global refugee regime, what supports them. Second, do you reconstruct institutional history, or see you have some refugee voices in the history, how to amplify the voice of the refugees? Second, with the depoliticization, I think there is also some issue to how the OAU kind of decided to keep the colonial borders, so that for the AU at the moment, because European refugees were produced due to wars between European states, whereas so OAU managed to stop that by recognizing the colonial borders. The refugees were produced due to domestic problems, internal conflicts. So I think OAU wanted to depoliticize it because it's not between states, but it is within states. Then I was thinking of how African actors, we call African actors, or these political actors early in the 1960s made that depoliticization vis-a-vis recognizing the refugees, how it worked together. My second one is for Henry. Yeah, then thank you for the presentation as well. I mean, conspiracy theory is quite interesting, see, but a bit simplistic. But also it covers, say, one's thinking. See, it's simple to say, no, it's a European conspiracy that we are underdeveloped. So European conspiracy that we are always in conflict. It is, see, now we start to say it's the Middle East, see, middle countries' hand that keep us in conflict. But what is more important is to come out with, see, the details of how this has happened, who is doing what is the interest, because all the states have their own interest, of course. So what is the interest of X against Y? And that detail is quite important. See, I mean, everyone could say it is the foreigners who keep us in conflict, but how are they doing that? Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm Eliana. I'm from in Madagascar, especially Tuliar, University of Tuliar. Thank you for all presentation early. It was really enriching, and congratulations to everyone. My question is for Stella. What coping strategy do women with disability adopt to remain within the ranks of displaced persons without disability, and especially in relation to other women? And the second question for Irian. Irian. Là, je veux m'exprimer un peu en français. Je suis francisant. J'ai besoin un peu d'éclaircissement par rapport à la phrase que vous avez utilisée. Le grand problème de l'Afrique, c'est que ils ne sont pas entrés dans l'histoire. C'est un peu touchant et ça me marque aussi, puisque si je prends l'exemple de mon pays, on nous considère, nous, dans le sud, un peu en retard par rapport aux gens de haut plateau ou bien aux gens dans le centre. C'est parce que c'est eux qui ont eu le pouvoir et les moyens de pouvoir étudier, d'écrire. Et du coup, ça nous a retardés par rapport à l'avancée de ce qu'on parle de histoire ou tout ce qui est éducation. Et là, ça m'a beaucoup frappé la phrase que vous avez utilisée. Merci.
Okay, merci. Thank you for 5 great papers. I have a question 9. So, oh, I picked it. Oh, no.
Ladies first. I insist.
Let me just know.
So, apologies first for cutting a line. Second, thank you for the great presentations. I have a question to my esteemed neighbor, Irian here. Many things to think about in your presentation. What threw me off a bit was that you treated the concept of migration management as a given, right? And not as a concept that is highly problematic in a way and has been an ongoing battle for like 15 years. Civil society is against it, IOM is promoting it. So then I looked into your paper, even if you're not happy about it, but actually in your paper it becomes much clearer. But as an idea, it would be a better framing from my perspective only if you say this is a seemingly benign concept, but actually it has very deep-rooted racist causes. If you would do so, on the other hand, I would say you should also acknowledge the big literature that has been already done on migration management. So for example, Anton Pecou and Martin Geiger have a very influential edited volume, The Politics of International Migration Management, where they talk about the top-down effect and all the problematic aspects. But I think this could be a very important contribution to it. The framing might be even more convincing this way. Thank you.
No, I'm sure it's if it's important only because of this excellent presentation. Thank you so much. I also have a question for you, but I'll come to you last. So I will start actually with Stella, and I think you raised a very, very important point, and maybe we talk about it in different events. But I feel I agree with Stella that the issue of disability is not really taken seriously in migration research, and I saw that other issues were not taken seriously, but they changed. So I think it's important that if something comes out of this meeting, is that we actually take a recommendation to mainstream the question of disability in our research, and to look at our research with from the perspective of people who live with disability. I can see also commonality between Gifty and Stella's presentation in the question of agency. It seems that the agency, the role of agency and resistance and community initiatives is always overlooked in migration governance. But then also this takes me to a bit of maybe not a very innocent question to Gifty. So if the state, you have already stated it, indicated that the state actually does not regularize. Do you think if the state intervened, the situation will be different? It would be better or less complicated? Because unfortunately, we see when the state starts to regulate, it actually considers actually people's development and people's contribution sometimes as a source of income through taxation, through restrictive policies and laws. So I just want you to contemplate if the state decided to intervene. I think sometimes it can be a disaster. I think for Ariana as well, I agree with what Stefan said about the regime of migration management, which is already very complicated. It's the baby of IOM, and it's hugely criticized, especially by scholars. But also, I appreciate that you brought this categorization and labeling, and you started to question them, and basically from a racial perspective, I just want to see how these concepts also interplay in the more modern migration management regime. Maybe you don't have time to talk about, all the details, but maybe if we can take one of them, like, the animalization, for example. How does it happen until today? I know you spoke about a little bit about stagnation, but can you give concrete examples, not only what not only the stereotypes, how this is really operating and how this actually provides, how can this make the refugee management regime or the displacement management regime more egalitarian or less egalitarian? Of course, less egalitarian, but again, I want to see, yeah. And also for Henry, and I think I also agree with Fakado about the question of conspiracy. And then I just started to think about everything you said in your presentation. I relate to it, and I think it's the same. But I find it difficult to prove it. The minute I start to talk about who sends the weapons, who wages war, I feel I get into the trap of conspiracy theory. And that's why I really look forward to your research to tell us how can we deal with this conspiracy theory. What are the grounds of this conspiracy theory? I think I have two questions for you. Sorry about that. So, and I'm sure that you have the answer for this question, and I'm sure that you have already tackled that in your research, but maybe the 10 minutes did not allow you to touch upon it, which is actually the history. Again, the historical, foundation for the African refugee regime. And I just wanted you to tell us the global context for a refugee regime at that moment, and how did it influence the African refugee regime? And the one last small question at the moment, because I'm asking this question because unfortunately at the moment, African refugees are becoming a defining feature or characteristic of the global refugee regime. So I don't know if you are also interested in the Sudan question, for example, considering that it is at the moment currently the largest refugee crisis in the world, how the African refugee regime is able to address or correspond to this such large crisis. Thank you.
I'm tempted to say no because I don't know how they'll answer all these questions, right? But I mean I don't have a question really, just some comments. So I was listening with kind of the ears of of a journal editor and thinking, what would make some of them, the papers coherent. So thanks a lot, Professor Mesha, for a brilliant talk. So I'm wondering, with the shift from the OAU to the AU, right? So the OAU itself was a product of conflicts about the direction, right? But had some radical positions. But you see, there was that shift that happens. There was this division that was deepened by the Cold War, right? The Moravia Casablanca group, various kind of iteration of it, so that the AU itself becomes compromised version of even what the OAU was. So perhaps that depoliticization, could it be that moment, just a suggestion to trace that. Irian, I think brilliant work. Thanks a lot for simply calling things for what they are, right? Because at times there are ways in which things get laundered, all kinds of terms, right? And I think for me, one of the key things in this is expertise, the point of expertise. I mean, you will find someone who really has absolutely no understanding of a particular context, no understanding, right, of a particular context. But okay, so so the question for me is expertise, right? So you're likely to find someone who has absolutely no understanding of a particular context, right? But somehow they can simply become an expert overnight. You get what I'm saying? So there's a whole process that makes that possible, the legitimization of ways of knowing from certain parts of the world. And I think this migration governance thing launders that through ideas of this detached, universal kind of idea around a benign, I think Stefan used the word benign, or was it Amir? I'm not sure, a benign kind of set of technicist approaches, but these things have histories, right? So I really like that. And my own suggesting around this would simply be, what if you trace how these ideas change over time? Because classical kind of racism is not necessarily what you find today, right? But tropes change, and how these tropes find a manifestation. For me, the typical one is the global compact, this thing about safe, orderly. I really find it weird, but people just use it, right? Safe, orderly. That thing about orderly just says to something, right? But people don't realize that it's about this chaotic. You remember Conrad, Heart of Darkness. So these things cause all kinds of things. So so this thing about the Sahel, two quick points, right? Maybe if you take seriously the idea of the scramble for Africa, the new scramble for Africa, right? The scramble over rare earth minerals in West Africa, lithium, right, which is a major thing. If you board a flight to Senegal and it passes by Guinea, it's interesting to see the flight is almost empty, but who gets off the flight, right? So I think maybe if you take these things seriously, perhaps then you could trace the political economy of extractivism and see the interests that are behind that. Only last year, Ukraine admitted that they provided intelligence to target Wagner Group in Mali. So of course, the frontier of the war is in Africa, but then we need to kind of provide that with some concrete data. And I think some new entrants, think of Turkey in Niger, right? The role of Turkey in Niger, and the role of the Gulf states in Sudan, in Senegal, logistics, but also the AES states, and the role of the Gulf states in the AES states, right? So finally, yeah, thank you very much, Stella. I think this is really, really important. And so that final point is really for Stella and Gifty. Gifty, brilliant, brilliant work. So this thing about commodification. So what if yes, we are looking at disability and displaced people, but what if we also look at commodification on, say, a societal level, right? Because you have this limited resources, that means that water, electricity, and so on is commodified, right? So that those at the bottom of the pile find it even more difficult to get access to this thing, right? So that the commodification, yes, has particular impact on disabled people, on women, lack of infrastructure, but it's really about the general direction of society, right? The commodification, the privatization, so that the broader question of political ecology, Gifty, that you raised, finds expression not just how it manifests on displaced people, but really how it manifests in terms of different social groups in society. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Any other question? No. Okay. Before giving the floor, giving the microphone to the presenters to make their observation and comment, give it to. I just would like to say two things. First, a question to you on your Africa refugee regime. My question is, now that, because the Africa refugee regime is connected to the UN system, to the UN regime. Now that the UN system is collapsing, what is the future of? Well, it has not totally collapsed, but it is collapsing. At least they are away. So what will be the consequences of that kind of situation? The second is, it's unfortunate that I was speaking after Faisal. It's to you, Henry. You know, when you talk about the Sahel region, people always mention the Western impact or the Western role, but they forget the Gulf. You know, I like your presentation this morning when you talked about the différents enchevêtrements. There are 8, I think. Huh? Among those enchevêtrements, religion is one of the important things. And who brought Wahhabia ideology in the West Africa region? It's in the 90s. It's the Gulf state countries. They participated in questioning the system that existed, which was based on Muslim Brotherhood system, to question that, and then people use that to really talk about all the discrimination that they were facing. All the insurgencies that you see today in the region, yeah, local people fighting against the government using some of those ideologies. That's a very important aspect. The second one is all those, I don't know how traffics that exist, particularly gold trafficking. The gold trafficking, and we all know where the gold is going, is Dubai. And today, the impact of that trafficking on the security situation in the country. Everywhere you see not state companies that are exploiting gold, but individuals. And who are they selling it to? Groups that are there. We even found, because now recently there was a problem at UEMOA level. You know, the UEMOA system is based on the principle of solidarity. We all have one basket. We all put our resources in one basket. And if one country has a problem, we use the basket to help the country. But UEMOA discovered recently that in particular IAS countries, they are selling their goals informally. They are not using the traditional way, and all the gold is going to the Gulf countries. And now the money is no longer put in the same basket. You understand? And which is also creating a number of problems. So I think it's really important when you talk about Western involvement and other to look at, to compare it with the local people involvement to other external actors. And today, it's not just the UAE, it's China also exploiting oil, gas, and many other things. So I think that's something that we need to look at very closely without making those sometimes simplistic statements. Give you back the floor. Maybe 2 to 3 minutes to each each other, to each of you, sorry. Please, starting. Yeah. No, 4 minutes. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much for all of your wonderful questions, and apologies if I do not answer every single one as thoroughly as I should. I'm going to try and tell a reasonably cohesive story. So somebody asked about the refugee regime, which for all intents and purposes we can think of for now as an arena of conflict that I look at in the book in 3 different cases or in 3 different pillars. One of them being the 1969 Refugee Convention, one of them being the Bureau for Refugee Higher Education, and the other one being resettlement. And I want to kind of zoom into the first case, the convention, because a lot of questions went into that direction. So for general global context, at that point in time, we find ourselves obviously at the end of the Second World War. And in 1951, as our contributor here mentioned correctly, the UNHCR starts drafting a refugee convention. The only African country at the table of the time was Egypt, simply because the rest of the continent was under colonial rule, and so no political representatives were invited. Now in 1963, fast forward, we have the founding of the Organization of African Unity, and from the very beginning, from the very founding moment, refugees are part of the conversation. Why? Because what we have at the point in time in international law is restricted temporarily and geographically to the European context. But it doesn't mean, obviously, that this is the first time that there are refugees or people seeking refuge on the African continent. It simply means that this is the first point in time where we have an organization that encompasses many African independent states that can think about how do we develop that would apply to the displacement we see on our continent, where the international law as it is right now doesn't apply yet. So they start basically in '64 drafting their own convention. And by the process of drafting their own convention, they are in constant conversation with the UNHCR. And the UNHCR sort of gets awakened to the fact that, well, what do we do now with the fact that there is now an organization that wants to have a continent-wide convention that applies to the continent of Africa? Because the UNHCR has a strong interest to be the guardian of the international refugee regime. So they start thinking, okay, we need to do something about this, and that's how the process of the '67 protocol then starts, right? So we know also that that then kind of takes away from both the geographic and the temporal limit, and actually does the job of internationalizing the international refugee regime. So then we could ask, well, why do we still have the African Convention in '69, which is after the protocol? And that's kind of an outcome of many different drafts. So there's yearly different drafts and a lot of conversations around the need for an Africa-wide response that sort of that is able to take into account challenges that are different. So in the European kind of story at the time, it's a lot about individual refugee protection, a lot about individual refugee, what's the word I'm looking for? Like you have to individually claim your status, right? Like, and that's something that's not very practical on a continent that's decolonizing, where you have a lot of movement across borders. So one of the things that happens is that group rights become central in this convention. Somebody asked what's new. So it's group rights at the point in time, it's refoulement, it's making asylum politically apolitical, very conscientiously, but it's also the definition. And this again comes back to the question of global aspects, right? Because this definition sort of starts making a global impact. So the Cartagena Declaration starts citing it. Belize, for instance, starts taking it into its own law. We see it also going into the Asian context, into the Pan-Arab context. And then finally in the 80s, the UNHCR also takes up the definition. So there's many ways in which this conversation from the 60s starts influencing and spreading out of the African continent, starts influencing international conversations. So that's just one example to sort of say, what are the kinds of negotiations I'm looking at? And they're very much negotiations that are kind of happening in conversations with the UNHCR and with developments in Europe, but they're very much sort of framing themselves against that in many ways. And there was another question about how African thinking is constructed sort of vis-a-vis Europe. In the conversation, Europe comes up a lot as a case study, specifically with regards to the Second World War, and it's then kind of framed as all the old refugees in Europe versus the new refugees on the African continent. So it's kind of coming up as a foil, but one that is insufficient to understand the realities on the continent, hence the need for this own new convention. And what I'm doing with another question, institutional history versus amplifying refugee voices, is I'm tracing concrete instances of negotiation. So for instance, Uganda, and I don't know at the top of my head again which year it was, I think 65, comes to one of the Committee of Five meetings and says, oh, we need to actually include the word sex into the refugee convention that we're drawing up. So that would be the equivalent of today's attempt to get gender into the convention, right? This is like way early, so this is in the 60s. It fails because all the other states kind of ridicule Uganda for the idea at the time. But I think it's important to also look at these failed attempts to change something, because we do learn about precisely this, what ideas were being negotiated and discussed at the time. And then when we trace these committee meetings, we also see instances of, for instance, displaced people being invited as experts. So for instance, there are people from Sudan being invited to explain displacement in Sudan to the Committee of Five, so that then they can, with that knowledge, draw up appropriate policies. So in that sense, they do come in the archive, so the voices are not completely neglected. And I think it's actually really important to also show that the archives contain those voices, but they're few and far in between, and you really have to sort of celebrate the moments when they come up in the archive. And let me just see. Okay, then there was the crucial question about politicization versus depoliticization. So I think there's a constant tension between this ideal of Pan-Africanism and this ideal of burden sharing that's already very prevalent in the discourse in the 1960s, and then a very differential treatment according to which refugees we're talking about. Sort of, are we talking about refugees from colonized territories, in which case there's basically no state that says we should not be helping them, and there's kind of this idea is not reality, but it's much more, people are much more open to discussing this, or whether we're talking about refugees from already independent countries, in which case they become hugely political. And so I would argue that the convention was not so much intended as a protection of refugees themselves, so kind of advancing the rights of the refugees, but it was much more an attempt to tell states how to behave, to not have refugees become a big issue that would threaten the unity of the continent. And that's what I meant by politicization of the refugee regime. So I know there's many more questions that I haven't gotten to, but I also am conscious of the fact that I got 4 minutes. On all the future-related questions, I am taking them with me as inspiration. This is precisely why I'm so glad that I was able to be here, so I get out of my historian bubble and I can start thinking about how to make this more relevant to the future and present. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I will start with the chair. Sane and Gaba, they comforted me with the comments they made, which showed that it was not just about conspiracy theory. It's about history and facts of history. That their comments have been taken, especially when we're talking about the scramble for Africa and the new scramble for Africa. And to say that it's not just talking about conspiracy theory, but talking about competing interests, which are not to the benefit of the Sahelian states. Competing interests by the different stakeholders as far as that is concerned. So I want to thank Sane and Gaba for their comments, well taken. I came across the Gulf states. I didn't really read much about, but I begin to see how relevant this is to this discussion. One of the our colleagues asked about climate change and conflict and displacement. I simply said that has been the dominant narrative. It is there, quite all right. But I was not focusing on that. I was focusing on the role of these other countries, the Western countries, in what they do, their actions, their activities, how they. And I agree with Fekadu, who pointed out and that you need to flesh in. I'm fully aware of that because it is research in progress. Then, with regards to the question of friction, I watched Ibrahim Traore land in Ghana, and I saw how he came out gallantly with his pistol and how he was well received. It speaks to the changing dynamics and what young people are observing from their study of history. You see, he was more popular than the president of Ghana, because he was speaking, they've been following his discussions. He's speaking to what they want to hear and to change the narrative. I'm talking about another narrative. So you can understand that when it comes to the friction comes because the AES states as they are suspicious of the rest of the ECOWAS member countries. They feel that they are not giving greater attention discussing the problems of Africa, West African countries, Sahelian states, so that on the table they can discuss and exchange ideas. Rather, they see them. As you see, France has a lot. After France was pushed out of Niger and pushed out of Burkina Faso, they started cutting Nigeria. They started getting very close to Nigeria. Even saw what happened in Benin when it was like a coup d'etat that failed. They started moving to another direction because they understood that people are beginning to recognize from history what they have done, and people are not appreciating it as much as possible. Then my very good friend asked a question about the major source of my argument from history and from the changing perception. From history and changing perception, that's exactly history has taught them this is what has been happening. It has gone on to another level now with the new scramble for Africa. I understand that Ethiopia was never colonized, so you may never understand exactly the dynamics as far as the Sahel is concerned. Yes, it's true. Stability can bring greater business, but in this case, it's not been the case. It's not been about stability, and there's some people who fear if you follow Ibrahim Traore, having fought at the war front, fought the jihadist groups, and seen the way the French were playing games and exploiting and carrying away their resources. It is one of his motivations. He talked about what he saw at the war front when he was at the front. And so he observed what was happening. And so he's speaking from the experience that he lived through, not just from what the other people are saying. So when there is chaos and people have competing interests and they know how they can secure, because he even talked about the security of some corridors. To exploit resources from Burkina Faso. While war was going on, the French ensured that they secure the corridor to get their resources out of Burkina Faso in the areas where they have resources to exploit. So it's what is informing the discussion. And like I pointed out, is like saying that the narrative has been a lot lopsided. They are underground, they are behind the scenes, they are beyond the surface contribution and actions that are fueling the displacement crisis that have to be tackled from the roots. If you don't tackle it from the roots, you'll be beating about the bush. Thank you.
Stella?
So, for the first question, you asked about the difference between access and accessibility. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's working. So we looked at it from the availability and accessibility. I don't know if that's what you are looking at. Availability and accessibility. So in the Ghanaian context where we had our data collected, they did have it available, but then it was privatized. So um, it's based on who owns it and who determines the prices. So in terms of accessibility, not everyone has access, although it is available in the community on private basis. So in terms of accessibility, people are constrained by the financial aspect, others constrained by the nature of the privatized toilet facilities, and even where, because they have to pay for bathing. They pay for the water, they pay for where they will bath, they pay for using the toilet. So the alternative is to use the beach side. And for Sierra Leone, in some of the communities, they were not available. So, especially with the water, some of them had to fetch from the swamp, where the health issues also comes to play. Some communities also had a water facility, but then there's according to them, there's a motor they are supposed to buy for it to be regulated. But because they do not have the financial capacity, most of the times it will be there and then nobody can have access to it. So they have to find alternative means, that's using the swamp water to do and most of them even drink from that. Yeah. So in terms of availability and accessibility, those are some of the infrastructure and financial barriers. So He asked about comparing IDPs access and then the Ghanaian community. Yes, there's not much difference, especially if there are other informal settlements in Ghana. But then the problem here, or what I'm looking at, is the vulnerability in terms of displacement. Because these people, as I said earlier in my presentation, they lose everything and have to start life again. But then they find themselves having to pay for the basic necessities of life. That is water, toilet facilities, and then probably sanitation. So yes, Ghana has a long way to go. But then if you are looking at displaced persons, their vulnerability, that's the height of their vulnerability, it is essential to also look at them. Because if you are always going to compare the host communities to the displaced communities, they might never have solutions for the displaced persons. So there's a need to also have um, a framework. I think there should be a framework for this. But then it's also essential to look at the displaced persons, although the Ghanaian community also has problems. That would take link me to your question about government intervention. So I also think that there should be collaboration. So growing up, I know that we had the public toilet system where the government builds the toilet and then they pay someone to sit there and they regulate it. But now it has all been privatized because now I don't hear about the public toilet anymore. And because of that, the person who owns the toilet and yeah, the person who owns the toilet determines the prices. So I asked one person, what if you have diarrhea? And then he said he has no choice. Sometimes you have to beg the person. And then in terms of dignity, you feel like you feel a bit down because you have to go and pay some or sorry, beg somebody to use the facility because you do not have money, or else they'll use the beach. So that is it. So I think there should be a collaboration between the government. Maybe the government can build the facilities and then hand it over to a private institution to regulate it. They would have to take their money, but then government should have a hand in it. That way they can regulate the prices for these public or basic services, even the water. All right. I think I've answered the question. Thank you.
Is this on? Does it work? Okay. Thank you so much. I'm going to try and answer Laura's and Amira's question in one about this sort of question about the good and the bad and the dehumanizing. I think, but maybe we can think of good and bad more as in like acceptable and unacceptable forms of blackness. They're both dehumanizing. They're both take away what makes people human, which is what white people are supposed to then inhabit, you know, fully. But they say black people are deficient in that. And I think it's important to note that, you know, this acceptable blackness or good blackness only exists under conditions of unfreedom. And acceptable is the version that affirms Western superiority, that affirms whiteness as smarter and better and, you know, more advanced. And maybe, you know, if we look at sort of the ideal refugee, so Amira, this is about you, the ideal refugee comes from a country that's chaotic, where the government can't govern, where the government can't provide for its own population, and they come and they're helpless and they need to be rescued. And, you know, as soon as they make a decision or they have a cell phone, they get punished for actually having agency. So that would be for me an example of how this comes in today. Same as if we're looking at, you know, the returnee who left not knowing that there's actually no future for him in Europe, and then comes back and starts from scratch and then kind of realizes that had he only listened to the IOM or to Europe, he would not only not have left, but he also they also know better what opportunities are actually there for them. They're explaining their own country to them and say, no, the paths are paved with gold here in Ghana, you can do it. So that for me would be this kind of epistemological authority that is reaffirmed in that kind of binary. And then bad or unacceptable blackness would be the one that defies the superiority, and then it gets punished for that. And I also think that the good and bad, they're both dehumanizing, but they play a political role, right? It's a way of pitting groups against one another. In the American context, that's often called respectability politics. You know, it's a way of getting an in, but at the expense of all the other ones that do not conform and do not reaffirm white supremacy. Other question, Stefan's question about migration management and the contestation around it. I think all systems of racial oppression were contested, right? There were rebellions on slave ships, apartheid was contested. But the question is that, you know, what Kwame Ture called the white power structure, it seems to reincarnate. It always rises from the ashes in a new format. And I mean, if we're honest, if you're a migration researcher that works closely with policy, I mean, we're all very frustrated, right? Because we have all this good evidence that proves all these claims that migration management, which is just a new version of an old thing in my mind. You know, they say this makes everything safer, but it actually kills more people. They say everybody in Africa wants to go to Europe. We know most people don't move or they move within the region. So there is a question for me around how impervious migration management is to this critique. It exists and it has always, this contestation exists, but it seems to be, you know, on the surface, if you look at it as a scientist, it's not achieving the goals that it says it will because it promises it's a win-win-win. It makes it better for everyone. So I think we need to ask what is the actual objective of it. And I think it's very effective in maintaining racial inequality. And I think that's more what it's meant to do rather than actually making it fair and equal and just, which is what it claims. And then the last question from over there, that was not my my opinion, what I stated. It was a quote by Nicolas Sarkozy. I think he was in Dakar in 2007 and he gave the speech. And I think when French presidents come to African countries and they start by saying, we are not here to lecture you, it's actually pretty obvious that that's exactly what they're going to do. Macron also did it. And yeah, it was just, I mean, there was a lot of outrage about it, about him saying that. It is obviously completely unacceptable to say something like that. And yet he gave a very long speech that expanded on this notion. Yeah. Okay. Have I answered everything?
Thank you. Thank you. You asked how do they cope. I remember when I made my speech, I said informal support and networks and religion community help them. Also within themselves, they help themselves. The other, you asked a question, how did they see themselves and how would they come out of it? Believe in me, being disabled is not an easy journey. But if you don't have the right people around you and you having the right mindset, you tend to not be stable at all time. But in this, you have to support them, listen to them, help them to understand that the situation they are in is not the end of their life. Just like the example I made earlier on, I said, the lady I met, she has been in that situation for 4 years, but just one day change her mindset, knowing fully well that she can do anything that she wants to do, refuse to give up in that situation. I also use myself as an example. I told myself that I will not remain where I am. But right now, where I am now has showed me that I can do more. Thank you.
Thank you not only for the statement that you made, but your hope you are giving to all of us. That if we fight, we will get more. We will get better situation and we will change, our own situation and the situation of our people. This conversation today, from the morning to now, have shown us that there is a lot to do. A lot to do in research, a lot of area to scrutinize, to see, to look at deeply, and also a lot of issues to really revisit. Because revisit in the way that it's bringing us new ideas on how to deal with these categories that have been created by states through wars, through sometimes also in Africa in many contexts, also natural disasters. So some of these categories. Hey, we talked a lot about refugees, about IDPs. Didn't mention all stateless persons. And I can tell you, for having done some work on stateless persons, there are millions on our continent, but they are invisible. Nobody can identify them. If I ask you in any African country the number of stateless persons, you don't know. So it tells us about the necessity and the importance of this kind of program, because it opened our eyes on issues to look at and also how to look at the issues, because we are having conversation on the different angles that we can use, the kind of collaboration maybe that can really try to tackle some of these issues. So I think one or two lessons that we can learn together, we can learn from the conversation today, that we need first to visit the theory behind some of these issues. And visiting the theories, meaning knowing better the history of some of these concepts and some of these treaties, because today, what you rightly said, the 1951 convention, there was no single African country, maybe except Ethiopia, who participated in the drafting. It was done by European for European context. And up to now, we are using it. Maybe UNHCR is trying to modernize it, to do it, but at the core, it's still, the translation of inequality. People imposing some way of dealing with issues. Understand? Even the fact that we created our own treaty, it didn't change a lot, because all these issues, it was again connected to the UN system. And again, even when we try to say that African solution to African problems, we are not capable of, putting those in practice. So I think here the community of scholars is also in a situation maybe to change the direction. And it's for all of us to work hard, to question some of these assumptions, to question some of these issues, so that we can open the windows, the doors for the next generation of researchers on issues. There are so many issues that have been today tackled. And even this morning, when someone was giving the numbers, the percentage of research done by African on African issues was little. So I think these are compelling also questions for all of us, because it's for us to take up our continent, our universities, our studies, our research center to another level. So I think today we started through these two panels to identify a number of issues. We have 3 other panels, and those 3 panels, like the one tomorrow, it's about border crisis, which was even bringing us closer to our realities. So I hope that, like today, we will keep on time. We will try to do our best to really make sure that we have a lot of discussion among ourselves, because the fact that we bring people here is to also have conversation about some of these issues. We are finishing at least on time, because it's not yet 5:30. And I think the first thing to do for all of us organizers is to apologize. Apologize for starting late, apologize for all the technical issues that we face, apologize for the lunch. When you are organizing in a university that is closed, in fact, the university is closed these days. There is no student around here. So that also explains some of the problems that we are facing. But I'm really sorry about it, and I hope but tomorrow. No, even if you are No, even if you are fine, but I think it's our duty to tell you sorry about it. So that's it. And I give the floor to Ed.
Thank you so much, Ibarima. I will switch to French. Merci. On avait en fait prévu de faire dans les discussions qu'on avait dans la préparation, on voulait faire un discours de fin pour chaque jour. Et finalement, on a fini par l'enlever, mais Ibrahima a très très bien résumé la journée. Donc merci beaucoup. Donc là, ce qu'on a fait, c'est qu'on a décalé la pause café à maintenant. Donc si vous voulez, vous pouvez tout à fait prendre un café avant de rentrer à l'hôtel. Une autre information est que le dîner ce soir donc, est plutôt à 20h. C'est écrit 19h30 sur le programme, mais ils ont 20h. Et troisième information, demain matin, le bus partira de votre hôtel à 8h45. The bus will leave your hotel at 8:45. Okay? Cela marque la fin de la journée. Donc, vous avez la pause café maintenant. Votre bus va partir à l'issue de cette pause café. Et on se retrouve ce soir pour le dîner, ou sinon demain matin. Merci beaucoup en tout cas. Merci. Yes, yes.